Hello, I'm Barry Silverberg, Director of the Center for Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, and this is Civil Society, a periodic podcast to provoke more thinking about issues affecting nonprofit effectiveness and success. Without argument, one of the most provocative and troubling issues facing our nonprofit, volunteer and professional leadership, and our organizations is the racial issues plaguing our society. More specifically, we have to look at and address the racial gap among our nonprofit leaders. My guests today are Thomas-Breitfeld and Frances Kunreuther, co-directors of the Building Movement Project. Together, they conducted a survey of nonprofit leaders that resulted in a report named Race to Lead, Confronting the Nonprofit Racial Leadership Gap. The report is provoking considerable discussion, and one would hope soul-searching for all of us who are in the sector, because we believe in equal opportunity, fairness, and justice for all. Sean has authored reports and articles on race, intersectionality, movement building, and social change. He is also an adjunct assistant professor of public service at the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, where he teaches on race, identity, and inclusion in organizations. Frances is co-author of Working Across Generations, Defining the Future of Nonprofit Leadership, and From the Ground Up, Grassroots Organizations Making Social Change. They're in our community to work with One Voice Central Texas, which has graciously encouraged us to interview them. Our deep appreciation to One Voice Central Texas and to our guests for taking the time and being willing to be interviewed despite a very, very hectic schedule. Sean and Frances, welcome. Before we begin, can you just tell us what the Building Movement Project is?
So the Building Movement Project was founded about 20 years ago to work with nonprofit organizations to help them be more social change and social justice oriented. Mm-hmm. So we work in three areas. We work on what we call movement building, which is how organizations can work across organizational boundaries and work across issue areas to create larger systemic change. Mm-hmm. We also do a whole lot of work with service providers, especially how they can engage their clients to have more voice, power, and agency. We have a great website on that called www.toolstoengage.org, and I can talk more about that later. And then we've done work in leadership. Mostly our work had been on generational shifts in leadership. We did a book, as you mentioned earlier. We've written several articles and papers, but we really switched gears a few years ago to look at race and leadership.
So you're basically involved in what I guess was once called grassroots.
Well, we work across different types of organizations. We work with grassroots organizations, we've worked with large social service agencies, we've worked with intermediary groups and capacity builders. What we do is research, we develop tools, we do training, and we also have some pilot sites where we test out new ideas.
Cool. So Sean, why are you involved in this? Besides the job, but why are you involved in this?
So I actually joined the board of the Building Movement Project about a decade ago when I was working as a community organizer. And the reason I got involved with BMP was because I wanted to have an opportunity to think at a different vantage point as opposed to just like the day-to-day campaigning that I was a part of, to think across movements, across organizations, to also think about what kind of movement capacity organizations needed. And so that was really what drew me to BMP. And then about 5 years ago, I was able to, for Frances, who founded Building Movement Project, she's sort of humble about that, but she founded the project, and she invited me to join as co-director about 5 years ago.
So Frances, what led you to create this?
Well, it's a funny story. I had run nonprofits. I was from New York, and then I had a fellowship with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And part of that fellowship year was spent at the Hauser Center for Nonprofit Organizations at Harvard. And when I left the fellowship, they invited me back to come be on their management team. And what I realized when I was at Harvard, now this center was just starting, is that who they worked with was like the Nature Conservancy and the American Red Cross. I came out of community work. I came out of service provision, but at a community level. And I was looking around saying, you know, where are my people? And so what I did is, one thing I'll just tell you about Harvard, it's really easy to raise money when you can put a Harvard by your name. So I raised a little bit of money to hold a meeting of people who were, what I would say, working for social change. They cared about systemic issues, even if they were a daycare center, or even if they work with people who were currently homeless. They cared about also addressing the larger, what we would call root causes of why people end up where they need services. So there I was at the Hauser Center, and we had this meeting, and at the end of the meeting, people said, we need some groups to help us with social change. So we started the project there. And so I was there for 5 years, and then left and took the project with me when I went back to New York.
So this started as a project at Harvard?
Yep,
cool.
It did.
So tell us what led you to do this recent study. Obviously it feels it clearly fits into the issues you're dealing with, but what was the immediate impetus to do the study?
Well, so Frances had been doing a lot of work on generational leadership, generational transitions, what it looked like when organizations had baby boomers and Gen Xers and millennials in the workplace together. And when I joined as co-director, I didn't have that background. And also it seemed like there were a lot of people who were doing leadership work from that perspective. And so we went to our board and said, we're not sure that BMP needs to be in this area of research, capacity building and training. Maybe we should consider sunsetting the leadership work. And we had one member of the board who basically said, that's worth considering, but I want to raise a different leadership issue. And this is someone working in the Black and Latino community in Los Angeles who was saying that she was seeing more white leaders in her community now than when she started her career. And once she said it, it's sort of like the floodgates open, because everyone else around the table is like, I'm seeing that too. They were seeing it in Detroit, they were seeing it in DC. And so that made us wonder what maybe is going on, like what makes this an observation that resonated so deeply with our board. And you know, the board is all people of color, but still it's one of those things where we've now said it a few times at presentations when we've been talking about the racial leadership gap, and it seems to be something that rings true for a lot of people, that the trends in communities are away from there being leadership of color in the nonprofit sector. And so that's really why we wanted to unpack the issue, and that really helped focus our work on leadership on race and the racial dynamics. And so after several years, well, I would say a year and a half of sort of doing a lot of background research, doing a lot of reading and talking to a lot of people, we decided that what it made sense to do was launch a national survey. And we did, and you know, we had an initial goal of getting 2,000 people to take the survey, and within 3 weeks we had that number. And so then we just doubled the number, and we ended up with over 4,200, 4,300 people across the country taking this national survey about nonprofits, leadership, and race.
What kind of questions did you ask people to elicit? We'll get to what your conclusions are in a few minutes, but what kind of questions did you ask that elicited the kind of information that reflected in your findings?
We sort of had 4 buckets of questions. So one set of questions were from like a data perspective, to be able to disaggregate and see if there are trends. So we wanted to know about people's own background, ethnically, racially, immigration experience, gender, sexuality, all of the sort of normal demographic identifier. Then we also wanted to know about their organization. So what kind of work did the organization do? Was it a social service provider or a community organizing group? Was it an identity-based organization like an immigrant rights organization or a racial justice organization or a feminist organization? So that was the one bucket, and we really used those questions to be able to identify, are there patterns in terms of responses to every other question based on those? And then there were questions about people's own path and aspiration to leadership and what kind of training and support they had received. There were a few questions about people assessing their own organizations, like is the organization doing enough on diversity? And then the last bucket of questions were attitudinal questions. So what did people think about diversity in the nonprofit sector? What did people see as the reasons that the racial leadership gap exists and has persisted for over a decade?
And what were some of the reasons that the gap exists? given all the conversation that takes place about it, I mean...
Well, maybe first we should say, what weren't the reasons? So...
Well, let me change my question. What weren't the reasons?
So one of the things that we found is that when we talked to people, there was all these assumptions about why people of color weren't in leadership. And what we found is it didn't have anything to do with education. We had equal, everybody in the survey had, people of color and white people had similar educational backgrounds. People of color and white respondents had similar training backgrounds. Mm-hmm. They had similar years in the sector. And actually, people of color aspired more to leadership than their white counterparts. So 10% more people of color said they wanted to be a leader of a nonprofit organization. Mm-hmm. So all those reasons were put to rest by the survey. It's a large enough sample that we could say, okay, we have equally qualified people of color and white people, and we have people of color who say they want to be leaders, and yet we persistently have under 20% of the sector led by people of color.
Mm-hmm. Now, so why does the gap exist?
Well,
we've explored why it doesn't exist.
Right. So the reason I say that is that particular assumption means that we keep training people of color to be better prepared to be leaders. But we're doing the wrong thing, because what people told us is that they were facing racialized barriers to leadership. Mm-hmm. So over a third of the respondents said that their race had respondents who were people of color said that their race had negatively impacted their career advancement. So a third of people said that has been negative for me, and then told story after story after story. We had a whole write-in section there where people told us how they had been discouraged from advancing in their organizations based on their race. We asked them questions about how do whiteboards help or hinder the advancement of people of color, and we heard that the board was a problem. We heard executive recruiters were not really trying to recruit people of color to nonprofit leadership jobs, and we heard this term, the fit, that people of color just didn't fit the profile of what a leader looked like.
So, was there a difference in the responses to some of these questions between the people of color and the Anglos?
Yeah, there were a lot of differences.
I mean, did they both see it?
I would say that
the issues the same way.
The structural barriers, certainly, there was a sort of more agreement on the part of people of color that the structural barriers were what were preventing people of color from moving into top-level leadership roles in the sector. But in general, over half of white respondents also understood and recognized those structural barriers. So, in one way, that's a good thing, because it means that there's almost a shared analysis of what the problem is. But there are still gaps, and the gaps were generally in the range of like 20% gap between people of color and whites in terms of agreement with what the actual barriers were to advancement.
So let me ask what may be an unasked question, because it's so obvious. Why does that make a difference?
Well, that question comes up a lot. People ask, well, what's the sort of business case for diversity at top-level leadership, top leadership roles in nonprofit organizations? And I think Frances has a very good response, which is, what's the business case for white people continuing to hold the power in nonprofit organizations? And so I think that is a legitimate question to put back. I think the question about business case feels like a very outdated way to approach the question of diversity. When the for-profit world was starting to explore these issues of diversity, there was a lot of work around making the business case for diversity. There was a lot of work to prove that more diverse teams came up with better solutions, were more innovative, all of those things. And maybe that was an important or necessary developmental step on the way, but I think at this point, given everything that's happening in the country, that we need to be beyond the business case and be focused on fundamentally equity and inclusion. The reason that it's important for nonprofit organizations to not be restricting access to the top, most powerful and influential roles in the sector to only be open to white people is because it's an issue of equity, and as a sector that is supposed to be focused on justice and social good, we have to live those values in terms of the way our own organizations are structured.
And
So,
80% of the respondents said, and this is cross-race, that it is a problem that the leadership of the nonprofit sector does not reflect the demographics of the United States. And it certainly doesn't reflect who nonprofits are often serving. So in both cases, they really identified that as a problem.
So in your study, and this may have gone beyond your study, what kind of resistance exists to you make a moral case primarily, in a case that says we should be true to ourselves, so that's why most people are involved in a nonprofit in the first place, to make it a better world. So what kind of resistance does your work bring out? Because it's not happening.
That's true, it's not happening. I would say oftentimes the resistance is not overt and direct, right? Yeah. So I think the resistance gets couched in questions about the validity or how representative the sample is, right? So that's one way that resistance does get expressed. I think fundamentally, though, the resistance is about people who currently are in those positions of power, fearing either losing that power or being held accountable to do things differently. And I think doing things differently is risky and sometimes challenging. And so it's easier, oftentimes, when an organization is recruiting, to recruit through the same old networks that they've always recruited through, to hire someone who is just like the person who filled that position previously. And so organizations, the question of like what it would be like for an organization to make itself ready for diversity, I think is something that leaders and boards really need to consider and take steps towards, in addition to just making the change and being inclusive in hiring practices and making sure that biases and prejudices are kept in check.
Sean says in his training, and now I'm saying it, that everyone has a boss. So the resistance is often this very subtle thing like, I would do this, but my board won't. Or my board would do this, but the funders won't. Or I would do it, but my executive director won't. And I think we need to start breaking down the passing it off to the boss. Because yes, that's all true, but it's if we have no agency or power to raise issues, ask questions, and take a stand on something that's so important. So everybody agrees with us, but nobody wants to really change anything. Like, we want to agree, but we don't want to have to change the way things are right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems you're talking about issues of personal accountability. But I also note that you didn't use the word inherent or implicit or any other words, racism, in the sector. Do you perceive there is the same attitudes and problems that plague the rest of our society?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's definitely racism that is playing out inside of organizations. And, you know, I think that the language of racism in partnership with the science around implicit bias, I think oftentimes they're framed as opposing analyses, but I think they actually are complementary. And so I think we're in a sector where people generally think of themselves as good, as liberal, as progressive, as oftentimes colorblind. And I think that the sort of narrative and the ethos of color blindness makes people unwilling to confront the ways that their actions have disparate impacts and lead to the maintenance of systemic inequality.
So what are some of the findings?
So we talked some about the structural barriers. We also did find that there were real challenges facing people of color that were more significant that faced white respondents. So for example, people of color reported that they had fewer networks to funders, that they had a harder time fundraising, and that they didn't have mentors, at least in the job. Sometimes they had mentors outside the job, but they didn't have mentors in the job. So we could start pinpointing where there were real challenges for people of color who were interested in advancing. We also found that people of color didn't always have the supports that they needed within the organization. They had the training and they had the education, but you know, if you don't have a champion in an organization to help you advance, you're kind of at a loss. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we heard in focus groups is people might have a mentor outside the organization that was helping them, but they really needed somebody inside the organization. And if you're in an organization that's predominantly white, you need a white champion to open up the doors and the access to advancement.
You know, it's interesting. I mean, you're basically talking about what we call around here an old boys network. You know, although there's plenty of old girls networks also.
Right.
Although that's probably not politically correct, call them old girls, but regardless. So, what has been the most surprising thing to you? I mean, you obviously went into this expecting to find certain kinds of situations. What's the most surprising outcome of your study?
I'm not sure that it's surprising, but what has been most sort of impactful or powerful for me is when either of us do this kind of a presentation of the data, and it opens up conversation. So I remember one of the first presentations that I did was largely to a group of executive directors from across the country. Most of them were white, just a sprinkling of a few people of color in the room. And all of these people are peers, know each other. And one of the people of color decides at the end to just say, I really appreciated the presentation and I want to just share with the group my own experience. And her white peers were shocked by the kind of racism that she had experienced in terms of managing her board of directors. Right. And you know, this is a set of folks who work together regularly and know each other as peers, and so that the sharing of this data from 4,000 people who took a survey, that it opens up the possibility for people to speak that truth around the pain and frustration that they have felt, I think is really important, because I don't think otherwise people get exposed, white people in the sector get exposed to the kind of, and I'll use the word racism, that many people of color are navigating as they try to advance and craft their careers. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was listening to NPR on the way over to this interview, and they were talking about a young adult fiction about a mythic black land. I forget the title of the book, and the author was making the point that people identify very strongly with their characters and their trouble. And she used an example of some young lady in someplace in Miami or someplace who had the same experience, because she used real life experience, and people didn't relate to that. They can relate to the myth. And I think that there is that clearly. I mean, your study shows that there's a tremendous gap in sort of empathy, but beyond empathy is really appreciating the different experiences we have, in terms of this. So in terms of time, we're moving fast here. So what do you see as systemic changes that are required? You mentioned, using broader networks so that we don't just go to our Anglo friends, and therefore obviously we're not going to find any, too many folks of color there. What are some of the systemic changes you feel folks ought to be working on, viewers and others ought to be working on?
So I think there are changes at multiple levels. So inside of an organization, I think what organizational leaders can do is push conversations at the senior leadership level and the board level around the organization's commitment to diversity, and how and whether that commitment is lived out in actual policies and practices inside of the organization. How inclusive is the organization? Do people of color feel that they are included, that they have voice, that they have power, that they have the potential and an opportunity for advancement? I think that those kind of internal organizational scan and assessment questions are really critical for both checking what's actually going on in organizations, but also making the case for an organization to do more and do better. Because I think that as a sector, as a community that is committed to and focused on justice, we're always going to need to be continually fine-tuning and upgrading how inclusive our organizations may be. And so I think that the openness and willingness for leaders to continually engage in those difficult conversations is really critical.
I also think that leaders, white leaders, need to start speaking up. This is not the job of people of color to raise awareness. Is your organization welcoming to people of color? Why would a person of color want to come work in your organization? I think the assumption is, oh, we need to open up, and then and then they're like, well, nobody applied for the job. You know, I tried. But what would make it welcoming? I would say the other thing is that we kind of need to switch the frame. If your board of directors is all white and you say, well, I can't find a person of color to meet these 6 criteria, where are you looking? What are they? Where do those criteria come from? Who's making the decisions? Are you spending the time you need to take change? And I so agree with Sean. This is not about talking. This is about saying we are going to take these steps. We have a 5-year plan, and this is how we're going to change. But it's also challenging. Sometimes people call them microaggressions, like the little things that people say or do that's either funny or a joke, or the things that we just let slide by. Sometimes it's just not okay to let it slide by. As a matter of fact, it's probably never okay to let it slide by. So I think we have to take more risks in a certain way. Why people just want to sit back and say, okay, it will happen, you know, over time. I might not be here, but it will happen. No, we need to be in the forefront of fighting racism. It's our people. We need to fight that ourselves. That's
a great way to end. I would just say, just for your information and to remind our viewers, our very first interview was with a black attorney who I know very well, and our conversation was basically, and the whole show was premised on what does it feel like being the only person of color in a board of all Anglos. And it was very interesting. I had introduced him to your study, and you know, he's gotten very involved. So I personally found your study very, very important. We were going down the road to create a program to improve competencies, and you guys were like hitting a brick wall and said, that's the wrong issue. Okay? And I think that's, so I thank you on a personal basis, because it's a matter of great interest and concern to our center. So thank you both.
Thank you.
So please visit our website, nonprofitaustin.org/civil society, to read more about the report we've been talking about and find more resources about the issues we've been talking about, and also to share your comments about today's podcast. This is Barry Silverberg with Civil Society, a Center for Nonprofit Studies podcast in collaboration with ACC TV. And I really want to thank the folks at ACC TV for making this possible, particularly this particular show. And I thank you for joining us.